Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a very special bonus episode about a book called Plan to Pivot. And we have with us the author of the book, Gerry Starsia. Hi, Gerry. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Vasco. Thanks very much for having me, and hello to your audience.
Absolutely. Over the last 2 decades, Gerry has been on the faculty at the University of Virginia. He brings the perspectives of a former project manager, program manager, project executive, and also business founder and CEO. That combination of real-world experience and doctoral-level research brings an interconnection between the theory and the practice, between what could be and what is. And obviously here on the podcast, we want to dive into the practical insights. For those of you who want all the details, you can get the book Plan to Pivot available at all the usual outlets. So Gerry, you wrote this book, Plan to Pivot, where you explore Agile in the context of managing and steering business organizations. Why did you write that book? What drove you to write it?
Sure. So thanks again, Vasco. Thanks for having me. And I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about this topic. My interest in Agile goes back to when I was in the business world. When I was a project manager and then business owner of a design, build, construction management company, my interest was to provide the best customer service and solution providing that I could for my customers. And as business got increasingly complicated and moved faster and faster, the faster paced business, and now I'm in the late 80s and into the 90s, my business started to become almost unmanageable. Information was flowing so quickly. Things were changing so quickly. I know that your audience may not be as old as I am, but in the late 80s and 90s, computerization had just come to the fore in businesses. And so I was lucky enough to have installed the first email system in my company that anybody had ever seen before. This was in the middle to late 80s. And so the world was changing. Computerization and communications, the ability to pick up a phone and call Helsinki or call Shanghai from a phone wasn't around in the 80s and became more and more of a sort of the part of doing business in the 90s. And so things were moving very quickly and businesses started to become more globalized, and complexity, I would argue, would be, complexity continued to evolve and pick up more and more speed. And so I was trying to figure out what to do to manage this increasing sort of chaos or complexity. And I was doing, as I said in my book, one of the things I say is, I was doing Agile before Agile was cool. I was really interested at the very beginning. It really take me back to the very beginning. I was really interested in tracking all of the different changing components of any construction project. And so like software engineering, where there's many, hundreds of thousands of lines of code sometimes, in construction, there are hundreds of thousands of parts and pieces and lots of different things that occur during the course of a project that change and create change. And so tracking those things and making sense of all of these disparate pieces and parts of a project started to create a need to tag these things and track these things and start to figure out how to manage and so we were doing this sort of complex, bringing customers to the projects, partnering with customers. I increasingly did more and more cost plus work instead of low bid work. And the complexion in the way business was being done was starting to change from this sort of low bid, lump sum 80s and early 90s to more of a partnering, communication sort of approach to the way things are done. And those are the early glimpses of Agile that started to emerge for me when my business was underway. And so what I started to do then is I started to run my projects that way, and I ran my project managers that way, and I partnered with my customers in that way. And I then applied those Agile approaches to running my business. My thought process is why not use these frameworks that I'm familiar with that seem to be working to run my business. And so my business became increasingly agile. And so I was much more transparent with my customers, the teamwork and staffing and supporting staff and staying flat and creating tight feedback loops were things that I was doing in my business in the 90s. So I was pleasantly surprised in 2001 when the Agile Manifesto was published and shared, that I looked at things that I saw, principles that were very familiar to my business. And so that's where it came from. It came from my practicing world as a practitioner and a project manager to a business owner. And then ultimately, when I got to, I made a career pivot after 2 decades in the construction management industry. I made a career pivot to higher education and started a research career. I was an executive at the University of Virginia for 20 years, but I also was a doctoral candidate. Ultimately, I got my PhD in 2010, and my area of interest has always been this application of Agile in the creation of strategy and in the management of strategy, and that's where it all comes from. And so I've spent the last 2 decades thinking about it and writing about it, and a lot of those ideas are in my book, Plan to Pivot. And so that's how I came to this.
Absolutely. We'll dive into that aspect of Agile applied to the creation and the execution of strategy in a minute. For me, it's quite surprising, and positively so, that you found the Agile Manifesto to be relevant for you because you were running a non-software business. I mean, my own experience, I have said it publicly that I think that Agile is not about software. It's a philosophy of business. And it's also not about processes. It's how we look at organizations and how to manage organizations. And most importantly, people, because it's right there in one of the values, right? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So I found in my own reflection and thinking that this might apply to other businesses. But of course, now I got you on the podcast, who comes from a completely different background, completely different industry. As you read the manifesto back then, like, what struck you? What led you to do the analogy of, okay, this applies to me as well, even though these guys are all IT consultants, and of course I'm not in IT.
So interestingly, so I was on the fence. I had IT people working for me, so I was very interested in Agile as it related to development and software projects and project management, and also I couldn't help but move that approach to software project management to construction project management and just project management in general. But I took it to let me just sort of frame it up this way: is as I started my career in higher education, I was in a similar situation that I was in my business, is that I was in an industry that I didn't know very well, but I was an executive. I was an experienced executive, and I tried to figure out how to adapt the way that I learned management in my business and from my MBA program and training. How's that going to work at the executive level in higher education? And higher education is an industry, I'm sure your audience knows, is a very slow-moving, traditional, bureaucratic kind of what I would describe as a business organism. So how can you use this, I think your expression of this new philosophy of business or this new approach to business, how does that apply in higher ed? And I found myself falling back on my Agile notions of how those apply in managing. So this is how it's happened for me in higher ed, is Agile and strategy are akin to one another. And for me, and Agile and the focus of Agile principles, customers' needs are number one. Relating the business interests with the developer's interests. So the business interest is with the project management team focus. Maintaining control of the implementation. Embracing change and preparing for change. Face-to-face communication and the high value on that. The piloting. So in higher ed, we do a lot of projects. We do a lot of, experimentation. So the idea of experimentation and piloting and getting feedback and preparing for change, all Agile principles. And then I think the value of postmortem, or reviewing what you've done, reviewing your work, creating a lessons learned archive, and then trying to avoid making the same mistakes over and over again, are all Agile principles that I think very clearly crosswalk very well over to strategy and strategic management. And so as I was starting my career at the University of Virginia as the chief operating officer of the business school, relatively speaking, it was a $75 million a year, 150 person. We served, let's say, 1,250 to 1,300 students. It was a fairly big, complicated kind of operation. And we are in an industry in the business schools that is highly competitive. And so in order to operate within operate this highly competitive unit within an otherwise kind of a slow-moving bureaucratic structure, we created a little Agile team at the McIntyre School of Commerce. And I will say that the same approach, when I took over as the chief operating officer at the Darden School of Business, the Graduate School of Business, we did the same thing at a bigger scale. And so the way that I saw this was falling back on my agile background or my agile approach to the way to manage projects. I thought, you know what? A lot of these principles crosswalk very well to my strategic management approach. So putting the customer, number one, in higher ed, the customer can be students, it can be parents, it can be faculty. In customers in the for-profit world, it's pretty straightforward. Your customer is your buyer, and you put your customer number one, whoever they are. In any case, the customer being number one crosswalked very well. The intersection of business and development. So our challenge in the business school was to drive more revenue into the school so we could afford to create programs and provide services to students in a very competitive market where our other competitors, some of them privates, some of them privately funded, were offering very high-level services. And so as a public business school, we needed to drive more revenue into the school. And so the idea of having the business and the developer or the program manager's interests well integrated or closely integrated was an easy walkover from agile to strategy, and so on and so forth. In my book, what I call this is agile management. It's the application of agile principles in strategic management. And there's a very clear crosswalk between all 12 agile principles, in my view, and the way organizations can be structured with the goal of keeping your arms around or keeping control of complexity and chaos. And so those are the ideas that's how I came at this. This is how it applied to me with respect to my role as an executive in higher education.
And as you continued your development of these ideas, you also started to do research, right? Perhaps one of the most interesting aspects for us who are practitioners out there working with businesses every day is some of the most frequent anti-patterns you've seen in the organizations that you studied as a researcher, because of course you were working as an executive in higher education, but you were also studying other organizations and comparing that to the model you had developed over the years. So what were those anti-patterns that you most frequently saw in the organizations that you studied?
So anti-patterns is a term that's very software engineering related. And I actually, when you sent that along to me as a conversation topic, I had to dig around a little bit. And in my world where I live, anti-patterns are so you have common solutions to common problems, and it's sometimes the simplest solution is the correct one. And in the complexity world, simplicity rules. At the end of the day, pattern recognition and keeping things simple and trying not to do too much are antidotes to complexity. And I would say that in anti-pattern kind of thinking, and in the writing that I've read about anti-patterns, I'll give you a couple of examples of how I've seen anti-patterns sort of function in my world, and I'm going to share a couple of anecdotes. So one of the anti-patterns that comes to me, particularly in bureaucracies, is the idea of sort of administrative self-serving rules and policies and structure. And so what happens in big companies and big organizations is administrators create structure and create policies and steps to follow that are somewhat administratively self-serving. And what I mean is it doesn't touch the customer. It doesn't help the team, but it forces you to do things that are not particularly value-added. And it becomes this sort of self-serving administrative. I'm the anti-bureaucrat, just so you know. This is why I push on flat organizations, because I just think the distance between the customer and the executives needs to be close enough so that the executives don't forget who the customers are. And that everybody in between then remembers who the customers are, and everybody in between remembers why they work. You're working to serve the customer, and you're working to benefit the organization, and you're working to generate a culture and a community that's successful. And I think the flatter the organization is, the better. So a long story to say that I think anti-patterns are this idea of administratively self-serving, can be administratively self-serving. Another anti-pattern that I think is worth mentioning, that I think matters, is what isn't measured isn't managed in strategy. And unmeasured outcomes, or projects that don't have clear goals and don't measure outcomes, just become, again, can go in the black hole of they keep going on, but they kind of don't end, or they underperform. And that feels to me in the same realm of this idea of anti-patterns. And so if I'm in the right realm in that regard, and I think I am, what I would think about in terms of antidotes to these kinds of issues is goes back to my project management background. It goes back to my Agile background. Is I think that when you have new programs, new businesses, new programs, new ideas, that the smartest way to roll these things out, and again, sort of back to my strategy thinking as well, is think about piloting, think about experimentation, think about when you have new businesses or new ideas around products and services, is pilot them. So you have a core portfolio of things that you do. In higher ed, it's teach students, collect tuition, teach students, and support faculty research. There's a new idea every day in higher ed because these are very smart people who walk around thinking about lots of new ideas, right? So how does the administrator cope with that? So what I try to do is help think through which ones have a likelihood of being successful with a team of smart people. And then we pilot. And we have incremental measures of whether or not these projects, these programs have potential. And how do you measure that potential? And then how do you invest or disinvest in these kinds of things? And so I would say that one of the antidotes to anti-patterns is piloting and testing and experimentation. And then something that we talked about before, Vasco, a little bit is, I think formalizing your post-mortem processes at the business level, like you would for a software or any other project, at the business level is what pilots, what experiments do you do or have you done that have done well and why? And what programs, pilots, or experiments have you done that haven't done well and why? And that collective information, that collective intelligence is incredibly valuable to organizations to decide what to do and what things seem to be working well. And when you understand why certain things work well, you do more of that. And there are factors usually that have to do with expertise, investment levels, customer demand, industry competitiveness, et cetera, that can be signals on why things work. And you need to identify those things and do more of those things. And it seems simplistic, but it's not, and it's hard in practice.
I totally recognize that because, of course, you use the word post-mortem. In our community, we talk about retrospectives, but they are pretty much the same process of collecting the things that work and, of course, also discovering the things that don't work to change them and having this in a fast enough cycle. Right? Because one of the things we talk about, I would say in the whole realm of management and strategy is this ability to adapt. And of course, it's easy to link that to Agile, right? Like adapting, yes. Agility is about adapting. But there's also another aspect, which is that if you adapt slower than the environment change, you're still no better than when you started, because the moment you start the adaptation, the environment has changed again. So there's also the need to do this quickly enough. And as you said, it's very easy to explain to someone what's a time box, right? Like it's in software development, we talk about 2 weeks as a time box, right? At the end of the yes. 2 weeks, you've done one full cycle, including the post-mortem or retrospectives. Mm-hmm. It's easy to explain, but not all businesses are set up to have it happen, right? Like right. We were talking about self-serving bureaucracies a minute ago. Well, some self-serving bureaucracies can take months to get anything done. I'm very much reminded of strategic processes like annual planning and so on. And the name already has the clue, where we plan annually and then we plan to execute the plan every year. Yes. And of course, the plan changes a few weeks into the year. And we're not changing the plan because that was the plan. That's what we agreed. Of right. course, we could dive into that. But I wanted to actually take us further into the universe that you create in your book and talk about what you call Agile organizational strategy. And mm-hmm. this is a topic that came up when I was reading through the work that you've done. And I would like you to take a minute to describe that for us first, and then tell us what are the key principles of that concept, Agile organizational strategy.
Sure. So I think we've touched on a few of them. And I think one of the principles that you just described is key and is the key principle of the book, which is to plan to pivot, prepare for change. Agile organizations, if you think about that as the filter through which you think about org structure and how communication flows, the question is, change happens, complexity happens. The question is, what are you going to do about it? A lot of the principles of Agile prepares the organization to adapt, to respond and react, to pivot away from something that's not returning in a for-profit is not giving you any ROI, and pivoting back towards, so away from something that's not returning to the company and pivoting towards something that is, and towards experiments that might be creating success and profit. I think that agile organizational strategy looks a lot like an agile project management team. Agile organizational strategy is a culture or a way of doing business. And to your point a few minutes ago, it's a philosophy, it's a way of doing business. And I think it goes back to putting your customers first, inviting your customers into your business, inviting your customers in to be part of planning discussions, meeting and seeing your customers, meeting them where they are, and asking them what's happening, what can we do better to help you be more successful? Because that cycle is a positive cycle. So going out and working with the customers. And I have a number of case studies. If you want to talk a little bit about a couple of case studies that deal with this, I'd be happy to share some of those. But at the end of the day, I think that's a big principle. That's an agile principle. That's it's sort of the core of agile organization strategy. I think the idea that the intersection of planning and doing, planning and strategy, business interests and implementation, and bringing those together in this continuous cycle is another idea around agile organizational strategy. And I describe this continuous cycle as creating an organizational culture. Everyone is a strategist. Everyone has the interests of the organization as job one and the interests of the customer as job one. And so if my product delivery person, if my salesperson, if my customer service rep, if my faculty member who's standing in front of students or standing in front of executives, those people need to know why what they do is important to the overall organization. And so this idea of understanding what we're doing, strategy, doing the things that are important to the business, implementation, sharing the business goals and why you matter and why this matters to you, the customer, is all part of this agile organizational strategy or this continuous cycle of strategy. And I think it does. I think it knits well with agile. If you go down the different agile principles that we've talked about is, face-to-face communication. So, get to your customer, invite the customer in, talk to your staff, invite them in, creating smart teams that are thinking about strategy and thinking about the business and hearing directly from the customer on what's going on is really key. So the flatness of the organization, I think, sits right with this very well, in that the executive who's sitting somewhere else, not knowing what the business needs are at the point of delivery, what the frontline manager needs in the business, that distance can be really detrimental to a business. So flattening the organization and creating tight feedback loops is also important. So all of these things, all of these components are part of this idea of agile organizational strategy.
Yeah, the flatten the organization is something that is very hard for us in the front line to do. But of course, it's very easy for us to tighten the feedback loops. And that's something that we can work on a daily basis. To flatten the organization, to support the impact of those tighter and faster feedback loops, of course, we want our managers to maybe read your book. So what are some of the key things we can go, to our managers, the people we talk to and get the plans from? How can we get them to be interested in reading about this and of course, reading your book and taking those lessons to heart?
It's a great question. And I think a lot about this. And I do remember my days as a project manager in a company of many projects and many project managers. And how do you scale an approach like Agile within the organization? First of all, I think it's important for your audience who are Agile practitioners and experts to know that not everybody is crazy about Agile. And most people don't know much about Agile. So we who know a lot about Agile assume that everybody knows about Agile. And one of the things in my books, one of the criticisms of my book is that I assume people know about Agile in the beginning. And if you read my book, I didn't spend enough time in the beginning describing Agile. But at the end of the day, some of this is about education. Many organizational leaders are business school graduates. And it has occurred to me over my career that I never learned Agile in business school. And most of my friends, not most of my friends, but many of my friends have been through business school and look at me when I say Agile, either as a critic because they don't know anything about it and say, you know what, that's the software guys doing Agile. Or they never learned it and don't know anything about it. And they look at me like, what's Agile and why should I care? So I think we have to, one, is recognize that there's a certain amount of education that has to happen. And when you have an organization that's got a lot of leaders at the top that aren't Agile advocates, the question is, how do we begin to get Agile in the parlance of the business? How do we start to do this, right? And so I think about this in this way. First of all, research shows that companies and teams who apply Agile principles to their operations outperform those that do not. So there's research out there that supports this idea. So that's number one. So number one is you got to educate and figure out how to share research or studies or case studies of the positive effect of Agile in different kinds of organizations and somehow get them to the leaders if you can. It's kind of part of education. Number two is, and it dovetails off of number one when you educate, is number two is you got to talk about results. So I think the research says the results are that if you use these Agile approaches, if you use Agile principles, that you will outperform those who don't. So if I say that and I'm talking to my next in command or my boss or the boss's boss, and we're having a conversation, maybe it's, well, let me try Agile on my next project. Or let me run Agile in this program and let's see how that works. And then the Agile advocates have to run a wonderful, skillfully handled Agile implementation. And I think that what happens is the results speak for themselves. So if you get a chance, if the door is open and you get a chance to start to implement Agile, I think the results will speak for themselves. And I think that leads to the next thing, which is demonstrate. So, the results lead to demonstrations. Use it in your teams, use it on your projects. Those teams who are outperforming the other teams in your organization will start to be noticed. And people will want to know what's going on. And what's going on is that Vasco's team is outperforming these other teams, and they're doing this thing called Agile. And while I don't really know much about it, it's going great. So let me figure out what's going on. It's a bit of nuance, but it's a way to get this concept starting to push out into an organization.
Absolutely. And why not give your boss also this episode with Gerry's interview and get him to be interested in maybe starting that first pilot or second pilot or piloting a new part of the organization, whatever that may be. Gerry, we're getting close to the end, but of course, we'll put the link to Plan to Pivot, the book that Gerry wrote. We'll put the link on the show notes so that people can easily find it. But how about you, Gerry? Where can we find you and the work that you're doing?
Great. Well, thanks, Vasco. Hey, I have a pre-author or pre-release. The book is available on pre-release through my website, which is GerryStarsia.com. I have on that website some information, some personal bio information. It's a very small website. I've tried to not do too much promotion, but I have my book link there, so you can buy the book, pre-author sale. I have case studies, if you're interested in those, for sale there, that some of them are have Agile basis. I'm happy to come and speak to groups, companies. I'm very interested in sharing this idea that we've talked about today, this application of Agile in management situations to help companies perform better. So I'm happy to come and do a talk, do some executive advisement or consulting, whatever helps your company do better work.
Absolutely. Gerry, it's been a pleasure. So thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
Thanks, Vasco. Thanks for having me. Thanks to your audience.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.